Let me just say, anyone who has any sort of a weak ego should definitely give a brown bag and listen to your life history. And if my parents heard this, they would say that those 9 years in Michigan as graduate student was really in lieu of alcoholism. Couldn't get out. I also want to say, by the way, I've been in this university for 20 years, which in itself is a scary number. But in that context, I don't know of any place and anyone who's done more to promote scholarship and dissemination than Dr. Edwards. I marvel at how much he gets done, and I fear for him because the more productive he is, the more accomplished he is, the more the university feels like, well, they must be overpaying him and giving too much money to the center because he can't do so much. He must have extra. So anyone and everyone who can should support the Humanities Center because it is an intellectual lifeblood in many ways. So with that, I thank Dr. Edwards for the opportunity. So what I want to do today, I want to dispel a couple of notions. This is not so much a primer on Marx, although I will talk about some of the things that I think matter. But rather it's sort of how do we understand Marx and how do we understand the concepts that Marx brings us as a tool for examining contemporary society, and especially in this case, contemporary non-Western, non-industrial society. So in reading, there were two things that struck me in preparation. One was coming across some work done by John Berger, who's a noted cultural critic, art historian, art critic, philosopher, poet, Renaissance person, and self-proclaimed Marxist. And in his research on the peasantry, he comes across a saying, and he says, he recounts, quote, "Do you know what the trees say when the axe comes into the forest? They say, when the axe comes into the forest, we look and we say, look, the handle is one of us." And to me that was instructive because it gave some insight into the ways in which we don't, as individuals, focus on the context in which we operate, but rather on the particulars that we can take some pleasure in. The other sort of similar thing was in Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte. He has a little scene where he's talking about how the working class, in defense of the revolution, marches off to the barricades against the monarchist forces, and then they come back home and find that their rents have been increased. And the foibles of not understanding the consequences of private property results in them doing things that seem to benefit them but don't in the end. So that's the context where I try to figure out how do we understand Marx and why do we see Marx. And what we have is a situation in which Marxism is assumed to have died. Soviet Union collapses, capitalism is victorious, Fukuyama writes the end of history, meaning that we now have a single path towards a liberal democracy. His subsequent book that just came out rethinks that and says, well, democracy is in trouble, but that's not the point of this talk. But the question is, does the Soviet Union equate with Marxism, or is it a particular form of a political social ideology that seems to be informed, and many would argue misinformed, by following the teachings of Marx? And what's important is to understand that a Marxist analysis really divulges and diverges into many forms of Marxism. And I'll get back to that in a little while. So when do we see Marx come up? So these are not radical journals. The Economist, Forbes, a journal of business. And these are the headlines that come out. Labor was right, Marx has a lot to teach today's politicians. Marx was right. Rulers of the world, read Marx. And so the question for me at this point is why? What do we think, what do they think we know from Marx? Why do we go to Marx? And what I'll get to in a couple of minutes is there is this, if you study neoclassical economics, which I had the misfortune of doing for many years, one of the things that you see, or if you pay attention, is that there's no internal narrative about crisis. Whenever there's a disconnect or any kind of problem in neoclassical economics, it's always assumed to be exogenous. And so when crisis happens, and this is after this is looking at the downturn of the economy and rising inequality, the narrative always is what happened outside, right? There's an oil shock, there's this, there's that. And so there's a lot of returning to Marx, because within Marx there's the notion that crisis is endemic to, and therefore endogenous to, the way systems operate. That crisis is not a surprise and some external aliens landing from the moon, but rather crisis is something that one can anticipate, whatever the system is. Feudalism went through a crisis, it collapsed, etc. And so what we have is, so we don't think about Marx in good times. The system seems to be working, everything seems to be going well, no one wants to raise any questions, and Marx is not needed, and in general, any reference to Marx is considered to scare us. They bring out socialism, they bring out class struggle, and it gets ignored. But when things go bad, and the system breaks, or it seems to break, or has a problem, there's a search for how do we understand this, right? I remember when I was a graduate student, and we'd have these discussions, and if any of you took a basic econ class, there's this notion of supply and demand and equilibrium price. And if the price goes down, factor prices go down, everyone lowers their price because they try to get market share. And then the model says, okay, but if factor prices go up, everyone raises their price. But there's no real discussion about the fact that there's inequality in the system, and the first person to raise their price to cover costs will lose market share. And so there's a stickiness in the system that is not explained by theory. And what Marxism gives you is sort of a mechanism for understanding how the system operates. So it's worth paying attention for a moment to think about what we mean by systems. And you read a lot of the literature that talk about economics or societies being historical systems, which is in some sense a contradiction. And by that I mean that when we talk about systems, there's an assumption of stability. Systems operate. And when systems operate, if there's some sort of stress in the system, then there's a transformation internal to the system. But at the end of the day, the system reinforces itself, restructures itself, and doesn't really change. And if I have to keep up with myself. By the way, I once listened to a talk by Kenneth Galbraith, and I have this constant problem. I always feel like I don't have enough to say, and I'm going to run out of things to say. And invariably, I end up with not having covered everything I want to say. And I'm reminded, Kenneth Galbraith once said, that academics can say anything in 30 minutes, but also can take 30 minutes to say anything. So I drone on a little bit. But if you look at systems, and the notion of systems, it's not unlike Marx's argument about base and superstructure. He argues that the base determines the kind of relationships, the forces in relationship production within an epoch, and that the base and superstructure relationship, the base defines what kind of superstructure should be in place, the superstructure being government laws, commercial laws, religious relationships, that sort of reproduce the base, but at the same time he says that the superstructure then becomes a sort of limitation on the base. In other words, the superstructure prevents the base from changing because it's busy reproducing itself as well. And therein lies the tension for Marx, that as the base is restricted from transforming, because it's a quote-unquote stable system, there will be internal contradictions and tensions that eventually explode, and that's why, for Marx, it's all internal. So one could take a quick, I can take 30 seconds and point out that under feudalism, you have certain kinds of legal structures, religious beliefs, institutions in place that reaffirm and reify the social relationships under feudalism, but those institutions themselves prevented the feudal relationships to change, even as society was changing, becoming there's more industry, there's more trade, and there were greater burdens on the agricultural sector, and that resulted in a tension that ultimately breaks the system. In France, it resulted in the beheading of the aristocracy. In England, it turns into how do we make the industrialist part of the aristocracy, so we have all these new positions of wealth. And if you're interested, there's some really interesting work done by Robert Brenner, for example, as a social historian, or for sociologists. If you haven't, you should read Barry Moore's Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, because what they do in their work is they demonstrate how this transformation, there's not a singular transformation from feudalism to capitalism, but one has to take into account the situation and the circumstances that define this transformation. Hence the second part, which is the focus on history. And what Marx is basically saying is that histories, the historical circumstances are really important in understanding what kind of changes are possible and how those changes manifest themselves. And so you have this dialectic, and Marx at one point says that, you make history, but history, the new society is on the ashes of the old. In other words, you can't go too far from the foundation that preceded you. So the kind of new society is a function of the kind of old society, and hence we would see in Barrington Moore's argument different kinds of capitalist societies, different forms of political structures, and he goes through sort of a liberal democracy in England, he goes through the bourgeois democracy in France, he articulates why we have the Russian Revolution, why we have the Civil War in the US, each of which is a transformation from a primarily feudal society to a primarily capitalist society, but taking on different shapes, different political orientations. So it's this merger of understanding systems, but understanding that systems have internal problems and putting them in historical context that's really important. So his theory of capitalism, right, so this is my point earlier, the Keynesian or monetarist notions of how societies operate economically don't provide us with any kind of model of crisis implicitly. There's an attempt at trying to figure out how to fix a crisis, but don't anticipate the crisis, which is why if you read the economic literature, economists have missed 15 out of the last 10 crises. Their predictions are never right because economics as a discipline is projecting forward by looking back. And those of you that are heavily quantitative should pay attention that regression to the mean sometimes puts you in the wrong direction. So Marx's model of capitalism as a social dynamic system provides more opportunity to look for the internal crises. And just to give you a brief idea, early forms of capitalism didn't have to struggle with resources because you had the vast expanse of land in the United States in the early days. You had transformation of land in Europe. And so that wasn't a crisis, but today we have resource issues that is a crisis. And so that's not, again, the purpose of this talk. So let's go back to Marx. Marx was writing at a point in time, England was going through the Industrial Revolution. We all seen these kinds of pictures. And what we see is a displacement of the population, the transformation. We see Engels writes his Conditions of the Working Class before Marx and Engels write Capital, where he's noticing the kind of terrible circumstances that results from the displacement of workers from the land into the crowded cities. And what we have is, I have little notes on my slides because I always forget something. So what we have is a story of capitalist development in the latter part of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, into the early 20th century, and Marx is talking about that process. And so the question for me today is, okay, we're no longer in the 19th century, right? Why are we reading Marx? What relevance does it have to us? And so one of the things that I wanted to point out is that he's writing at a point in time of the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and the question is, does his notion of forces and relations of production and internal dynamics have much to say about the 20th and 21st century, sort of the forces and relations and transforming? 90% of global production at the time of Marx's writing was either in England or sort of northwestern Europe in parts of Brussels, Holland, parts of France with the development of certain kinds of industries. But today, 70%, 75% of global production is outside of Europe, is in Asia, and about half or more than half of that is in China. And if you looked at the paper, I think in yesterday's New York Times or today's New York Times, I don't remember, there's an article about the trade war and how people are trying to avoid the trade war. And the question is, can Cambodia do what China did for the world, be the new? So there's talk about Cambodia, there's talk about Vietnam, but clearly the industrial production of the world has shifted. So even though we're not talking about European industrial production, and even though manufacturing is in decline in the old, in the sort of the core countries of modern capitalism, we still have the situation in Asia where the factories, maybe they're cleaner, but they're still organized like capitalist activities. And you don't have to go too deep into the news to read about suicide attempts at workers at Foxconn in China. If you're interested, there's right now, Foxconn is taking a very large swath of land in Wisconsin, building a large plant, and there's a big argument with the community because the question is what kind of plant, what kind of legacy does Foxconn bring us? But we have global production that is really in its own form no less scary. It's just cleaner. It's more effective. And the industrial production, so take this region. In the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, massive amounts of cars are produced, and the workforce comes from the Southeast Michigan region and some other parts of the country. And we today make as many cars as we've ever made, but we have a quarter of the workforce because of technological innovation. So industry is transforming in the core, but it's not transforming in the periphery, and it's moving to the periphery. So if we have capitalist social relations, and I've spent some time in China recently, and they're going through their own sort of craziness. They're talking about socialism with Chinese characteristics. Just as a little aside, if you go to China right now, Chinese history goes from, through the wars in the 30s against the Japanese, against the Kuomintang, the victory of the Communist Party, into the 60s, into the 50s, and the Great Leap Forward, and then you get into early 1960, and boom, next thing you know, you're in 1975, because the Cultural Revolution disappears, and the basic line now is you need planned economy to build the infrastructure, but now we have an infrastructure and we need a market economy to enhance consumer demands. The tension in China is how do you encourage consumption and expectations and not also get people demanding, and so you have this tension right now where they're trying to suppress workers' demands, and they're doing all sorts of things that we can talk about at some point, which is why I think China's a really interesting situation. And that and the Belt and Road Initiative, which they're struggling with not how not to be an imperial power, but a lot of things that they're doing sort of is reminiscent of some of the early imperialist efforts. So how can Marx's ideas inform our analysis of contemporary capitalism? And my argument is that contemporary capitalism, as Marx understood it, occurs outside of the Western world. Because now in the West, instead of focusing on the production of things, we focus on the sort of financialization. We don't really care. When I was growing up, R&D was a big thing. Kodak, IBM, all these companies would invest decades into making new products, enhancing things. Today it's all about rate of return, and if you don't show a profit in 2 or 3 quarters, you move on to the next thing. And so what happens in the global South? What's going on? What do we mean by the global South? All right. So the global South is often referred to as somehow different, right? It's the product of colonialism with different historical roots and underpinnings, and therefore Marx is no longer relevant because Marx is writing about a situation which is no longer the case. See, I know I have other thoughts to say, but anyway, but this fails to understand how Marx examines society of his day as a method as opposed to a particular, it's the difference between how we understand something and apply the methodology to the particular way in which Marx argued and applied the methodology of his day. And so I want to focus on 2 things that I consider to be important in Marx's contribution in terms of ways of thinking. One is historical materialism, which allows us to study the inevitable and highly specific tensions that emerge through the development of any society. And it shows an interdependence of political and economic dimensions of income and wealth creation. In other words, what is capitalism at the end of the day but something that produces wealth in a very particular way? And going back to early definitions for Marx, forces and relations of production, the forces of production simply are, overstating it, the technological capabilities, the level of resources available, the skill sets of the the workers. It's basically any society has the ability to produce a certain amount at any particular point in time. The relations of production is how society organizes that production and the product of that production and how it distributes whatever is produced. So in a capitalist society where ownership of the means of production means that certain people have claims, and for Marx it was sort of the examination of how under feudalism, when you produce so much wheat and someone comes with a sword and takes away a third of your production, you know what's being taken away. But under capitalism, Marx says, we don't know what's being taken away because we're separated. The other is this notion of commodification, unfettered commodification. And he focuses on commodification in his very first chapter of Capital, where what he's doing is he's trying to figure out what do we mean by this commodity. He refers to commodity fetishism, right? And what, after all, is a commodity? And he makes this distinction between what he calls use value and exchange value, and that's not the purpose of this talk. But at the end of the day, what he's trying to argue is that when we produce something and we want to use it, we know what we're producing and we benefit from the production. But when we get engaged in production, when we are separated from the ability to control what we produce, and he goes one step further, when we sell our ability to work, that's the distinction between labor and labor power, then what we're doing is we're selling our ability to spend time laboring, but we have no connection to the product of our labor. And so what we do is we show up at work for 8 hours and we get a paycheck or we get a bundle of goods. And he talks about the social necessary commodity bundle. So 1 year, it's, at one point in time, when I first moved here, I was in a cafe in Birmingham and some people were looking for a house, and one person says, one of my requirements is that there's a pool in the backyard, right? Clearly her commodity bundle is different than my commodity bundle, right? What I need to make. But commodity production has consequences. And, those of you interested in what should I call it, in environmental justice and things like that, we have a whole history of recognizing that there are negative, social outcomes. Factory upriver dumps into the river, and when your kids go swimming, they come out green. That's not good, so we pass laws. That's the base superstructure tension. And what the laws are trying to do is privatize social costs. When we don't clean up the rivers, and we ask society to clean up the rivers, then society has to invest the money. But when we pass laws that say you can't dump, then you have to clean up your waste. Then they complain, they say, well, it's going to cause us to raise the price of our good, and then the argument is, we'll let the consumer who wants your goods pay that cost. And so you're privatizing social costs. And if you study environmental law, and you don't have to go too far in the last couple of months, you can see that environmental rules go up and down depending on what political orientation we're in. And now, not to make much of this, but I heard a recent speech by our current president who described how they actually clean the coal before they use it, not understanding what clean coal means. And so there's all these sort of differences in environmental laws that go up and down. But really, unfettered commodification and the whole notion of commodity production helps us understand not just inequality and wealth creation within a particular country, but also helps us understand the differences between countries in a global system. So what happens? We have different strands of Marxism over the 21st century. And what historical materialism allows us to do is explore particular ways in which regions develop and how those relationships result in uneven development within and between countries in a global system of production. Commodification also tells us about how there are negative consequences and who bears those consequences. One of the things that I'm reminded of if you look at urban development, Mike Davis in his book City of Slums points out that for many years going to the city from the rural sector, wherever it is, was going for opportunity. You didn't have much possibility. You come from a small village, you move into the city, there's all this activity, this production, this possibility. But over time, as capitalism encroaches on the rural sector, you have more and more people, what Marx referred to as surplus to the needs of a production, moving to the cities, and cities become repositories of unemployable and unemployed workers. And so you have what he calls the cities of slums, where you see this massive growth. And it's not an accident that if you look at the fastest growing and largest cities in the world, they are in third world countries. They're in Asia, they're in Latin America. The scale is enormous. Just to give you an idea, Shanghai is something like 6,000 square miles. Detroit is 138 square miles. What that means is that Shanghai has built 17 railroad, subway lines that are each about 30 kilometers long, all throughout the city, and it takes you an hour or more on pretty fast, efficient trains to get around the city. And yet, when you travel around the city, it's just, they're, depending on where you are, you're either at very expensive, in fact, Mao's house when he lived in Shanghai in the 30s is right nestled in the middle of a collection of shopping centers that make you feel like you're on Rodeo Drive in Hollywood. Other parts of the city, it's really almost what you'd imagine a third world city would look like. But the commodification, sort of one example, think about the last couple of years we've been sort of hearing about how all the data that we provide on Facebook or various data mining, we provide that for free. We get engaged and someone is collecting all that data and commodifies it and makes money out of it and sells it and does whatever they want, right? So what can we do for the global south in terms of analysis? Well, his abstract ideas about society are relevant to understanding how people earn a living, right? What is it that people do? And how do they function in that society? About capitalism in Europe, early on in his, if you read the Communist Manifesto, he points out that capitalism, even at its very beginning, is a global process. And a good example of that is during the height of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the farmland in England was, you may have read about the enclosure movement, displacing farmers, displacing whole villages. As an aside, you might want to read Hobsbawm's Captain Swing, which is all about how villages, commercial villages, bakers, blacksmiths, all got displaced. And they go to court because they're objecting to this displacement, and the judge finds them guilty and gives them a choice: prison ship in the harbor or deportation to Australia, which is why we think of Australia as a penal colony, but really with a small fraction being true prisoners of violent crimes. It's whole communities, people with middle-class sentiments and skill sets that move and populate Australia. And you should go to Australia. It's an interesting country. It's enormous, and everybody lives within about 10 miles of the coast because the inland is insane. So this notion of global characteristic gives us the context for understanding that global south is part of a global network. It's not something different. The colonial period doesn't make it somehow different. And it sort of helps inform our understanding of ongoing relationships with the North and South. So the post-colonial legacy of the global South doesn't necessarily alter. Some people say, well, India was a British colony and now it's a different, it has a different history. African countries have, we're either French colonies or British colonies or German colonies in Latin America, etc. And I would argue that this post-colonial legacy doesn't undermine the ability to apply Marx to an analysis of what's going on in the system. So I identified 6 concepts that I think are central, that give you some idea of where we want to apply the concepts on Marx. One is this notion of multiple class relations. And what we have to understand is that societies that have, that it's not just about less income or more absolute poverty, but we have to understand them in class terms. In other words, what happens in a lot of these countries, they're undergoing, much like societies in the US did, undergoing sort of internal transformations and revolutions. But the revolutions in many cases are aborted or incomplete. So you have revolutions against property classes, you have revolutions that try to impose democratic institutions, revolutions that include agrarian revolutions against feudal relationships, and so on and so forth. and that and what's important is that capitalism in the global south, more so than in the north, coexists with many forms of early social formations that contain remnants of feudal relationships. So you have at the same time an industrial core in the cities, and you have a feudal relationship in the country, and those class relations create special circumstances that need to be explored. And sort of capitalism exists in pre-capitalist conditions, which is very unique, and we have to understand it. Primitive accumulation is another concept, and what it is that Marx pays attention to dispossession of resources. In other words, I mentioned briefly before, Marx is arguing that when you lose control over the means of production, you are subject to whatever relationships you can then craft out. So until we have certain kinds of labor laws, we can pay you, we don't pay you overtime for hours, we can make you work 15 hours a day. There are all sorts of requirements, and that we have to understand that small-scale farmers in these societies, pre-capitalist societies, are always in a sort of a struggle in terms of their dispossession of their resources. And so you have the circumstances where farmers are producing as direct producers. One example is Mozambique, for example, which has constant problems of sufficient food production, and yet Mozambique is one of the world's major exporters of cashews. And why do we want cashews? Because people in the West and in industrial countries want to have cashews when they sit at the bar having a drink. So you have free cashews at the bar, and meanwhile, farmers in Mozambique are not producing enough food because of sort of corporate ownership of the land, and you make more money producing cashews for export than you make producing food for domestic consumption. And so what happens is, another way to understand this is that capitalism itself depended on this dispossession. I don't know if I'm going to mention it here or later on, but let's just consider, well, the next slide. Let's consider economic and extra-economic coercion. So capitalism is based on coercion, right? People are forced to go to work if they want to survive. You can't simply say, I'm going to stay home and grow my own food. You don't have the resources. You may have a small plot, but it doesn't really enable you. You have to take a job. You have to get involved in the capitalist relationships. But extra economic coercion can include things like slavery. And we shouldn't think of slavery as an old system because slavery still exists. But if you think about growth of capitalism and capitalist development, without slavery you wouldn't have had massive cotton production that's produced both in the US and Egypt, major cotton producers. Without cotton, you wouldn't have the Industrial Revolution. Without the Industrial Revolution, the slavery gave the colonies their value. And at the same time, the food production in the colonies displaced, because if you change all the agricultural land in the core country, in England, for example, who's producing the food? So they're all raising sheep to shear, to add wool to the industrial production of England, and that depends on being able to import food from other parts of the world. So there's a relationship, Marx argues, that capitalism depends on these global trade relationships. And if you read Wallerstein or you read Chris Chase Dunn, they're arguing that capitalism is a world system that's been in existence for hundreds of years. And sometimes you listen to Chris Chase Dunn and he goes back 1,000 years, and that gets a little dizzying. But what you have, if slavery is important at a point in time in development of the Western core countries, we have to recognize that slavery persists and continues in the global South today. And it serves a very important non-economic, extra-economic, coercive role. So we need to understand how slavery disciplines unfree labor. By disciplining labor, it's just what keeps you from going on strike. You don't have a strike if anybody can replace you, and there are no laws protecting your job, for example. Instability and inequality. So Marx very carefully identifies internal processes that develop, that they need to expand, polarize, destabilize, and destroy, right? Schumpeter has this notion of constructive destruction, right? David Harvey talks about the need to constantly tear down buildings and cities so you can invest the capital to build something new. Even this building you're in right now is in itself past its sell-by date because it wasn't built to last a very long much longer, as long as it's been here. I mean, when I started here, I think the building was 24 years old, 23 years old. Someone who's been here longer than me might remember. But you know, we can't hold classrooms in this building because it's not coded properly. It doesn't have the proper fire protection. Only assemblies like this periodically. And so what you have is, for Marx in capitalist society, a model, an argument for how rich and poor develops, how appropriation of resources, how inequality fosters. By applying the same kind of internal logic, you can begin to understand the relationship between global north and global south, rising inequality, differences between global south countries. And the dynamics are important because what we're finding, some people like Heidi Gottfried here and others are doing research on care work, for example, and what you're seeing is a lot of people this whole migration, global migration that's making everybody crazy in the US and Europe, is all about seeking better opportunities, but it's also, you're bringing in women in the third world to take care of your children. If you go to any big city and you walk down the street, there are people pushing wagons with children, and it's clear that they're not the parents. And there's some research now that shows even in these developing countries where you have rich cohorts in cities, they're hiring poor women as well, and it's a displacement of the work of women. So that this notion of global rich and global poor is important to understand the relationship between countries. And super exploitation, I think that's my last. No. Super exploitation is, well, peasant labor coexists with wage labor in the global south. And what that means is that you have inherently, you have a labor force that potentially can undermine whatever the industrial workers might be able to do, because all you need to do is displace peasants. The peasants, I mentioned Mike Davis's work on why people come to the cities. And so if you have oversupply of labor, it undermines the cost of labor. And if you have these sort of displacement of profitability from the, you're moving, I mean, most colonies, or most former colonies, if you look at capital flows, it flows from the colonies, or the former colonies, back to the core. There's not a capital investment out to these countries. And so you need to look at the development of absolute poverty in the context of systemic processes. And then you have imperialism and underdevelopment, right? In other words, capitalist relations and social relations appear on many different scales. Cities, regions, countries, globally. And it's important to understand how we displace crisis. So a lot of the consequences of the financial crisis that happened in 2008, for example, we read a lot about how Greece or other countries are asked to bear the burden. You look right now, I think in today's paper, this is going to come home to roost, there was an article about how our debt service on our federal debt is soon going to cost more every year than what we spend on the military budget. Now, that's an interesting little piece of data, but it's also a harbinger of what to pay attention to, because the current arguments are we have no choice but to continue to support our military because of our global responsibility or our global reach. But at the same time, this budget stuff is difficult, and they're already making noises about cutting into Social Security, cutting into Medicare, cutting into other sort of social programs to help cover that shortfall. And then we ended up, this is not the point of this talk, but we end up into arguments about what do we mean by entitlement, because they often refer to Social Security and Medicare as entitlement. But for any of you that work for a living, know that every paycheck you get an insurance deduction, insurance for Social Security, insurance for Medicare. It's not called a gift to the government, it's called an insurance payment, because what you're doing is you're basically contracting for a benefit at the end of your life, and it's not an entitlement, you pay for it, but it's all about newspeak. So what we need to do, what I think we need to do, is recognize that we move away from a Eurocentric perspective on capitalist development and Marxism, and recognize that these various regional variations, these different regional variations of relationships, of development, of underdevelopment, of exploitation, results in many Marxisms that are different. There's an African Marxism, there's a Chinese Marxism, Asian Marxism, right? And these are different what it is it's applying sort of a basic set of precepts, underlying arguments about what is a Marxist analysis, but taking into a concept, putting it into context of each local relationship. And it doesn't just happen in terms of Marxism. You have liberation theology in different parts of the world. You have different kinds of ideologies that emerge that reflect on the current state and the historical relationships in the country. So what I would argue is we need fewer Marxisms and more Marx. Right? We need fewer sort of meandering, and we need to go back to some basics. What made me think about that is Xi Jinping, the day before the World Congress on the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, gives a speech and he says the Communist Party of China should pay attention to the Communist Manifesto as a model for how they should move forward. But then at the end of the speech we talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. I have no idea what that means, right? But it clearly means that we're going to apply Marxism in a very particular way. And so what we need to do is go back. If we want to have a serious understanding of what's going on in the global south, we need to go back and examine and use Marx. So this is Karl, 1818. This is the 200th anniversary, 200th anniversary of his birth. It's 150 years since the publication of the Communist Manifesto. It's 50 years since the global revolutionary period of 1968, which saw everything from closing universities and anti-war movements in the US to student demonstrations in Mexico and the killing of students by the military and the police, to events in France, to activities in Africa, to globally all sorts of activities, and also in terms of the Cultural Revolution. A little aside, when I first went to Shanghai, my very first visit, I marveled at the fact that my academic career begins with Chinese studies. And my very first serious academic writing, this is what, 45 years ago, was trying to understand the Cultural Revolution, and specifically the tension between temporary workers and permanent workers in Shanghai during the rise of the Gang of Four, and the war that occurred, and the demise of the party, and all this. And as I'm talking to the dean of the graduate school, who brought me out, he's my host, and we're walking and we're talking about this, and I get to the discussion of the role of the Gang of Four, and he turns to me and he says, "We don't talk about them anymore." And it's again, it's a question of how do we understand our own history? And China is trying to recapture its history. So, for example, it's very hard in China to write about or talk about Tiananmen Square. It's hard to talk about Tibet. It's hard to talk about several topics, including the Gang of Four, which has disappeared. But the fact is, it's there. It's there. It's not in China. We don't, look, before we get too critical of China, Texas textbooks just made a change. Hillary Clinton is no longer in their high school textbooks. Helen Keller is being removed from the high school textbooks. Some states, the textbooks have, Africans came to the United States. There's no longer talk about mass slave. I mean, so we all are in process of seeing our social histories being transformed, and we need to be vigilant if we want to have accurate understandings of how our society functions. So I'm going to stop there because we end in 6 minutes, and my meter is in 26 minutes. So, and the $45 is too much to pay. So I will open it to any kind of questions and thoughts and comments, and Kahari's going to ask me in a minute, what about religion? We have a different question.
Questions, comments?
Go ahead, Kahari, do yours.
Oh, okay, sure. Thanks for giving me a talk. My question has to do with while you were talking about the problem of capitalism, issues, crises that emerge within capitalism. I was thinking about just human nature, and that part of human nature is greed, and that it seems easy to kind of stoke that part of human nature, that you need more, and that if someone or some group or some country have more than you, that it's some type of indictment of our personal worth and well-being. in that, at least within the US, we see commercials all the time that says that you need to have, the newest computer, newest phone, newest car, newest everything. And it seems that, I don't know how you turn that down. I don't know how you can limit that. It seems easy, like just real quick, with my kids, when they were young, they didn't want stuff. I didn't have to tell them to get the extra toy. They just instinctively wanted something else. I had to tell them that you don't need the extra toy, or to share your toys with your sister or your friend or whatever. I have to teach them that. I don't have to teach them to just grab whatever you want. And so it seems like with commercialism, it's encouraging us to just want more and feel good about it. And it's like that will inevitably lead to crisis. If you're buying stuff you can't afford, or you're overproducing stuff, there's no market for it. This is just thoughts that are coming to my head in terms of how do you...
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so let me break that into two parts.
Yeah.
Greed, which I'll take over in a second, and desire. This is really what it comes down to, right? So one of the things that, if you read Marx, he argues, if you remember, he has this MCM prime narrative, which is, in the beginning you make a commodity, you sell it for some cash so you can buy another commodity, and all you're doing is satisfying your needs, and you can't satisfy it with the commodities you have, so you find substitution. And money is nothing more than a measure of exchange. It has no intrinsic value outside of that. And then he develops this notion of MCM prime, which is what you're talking about, which is money becomes the resources, whether it's paying labor or buying the raw materials, to make something for the purpose of selling it to make more money than what it cost you. And therein lies, for Marx, the solution, which is somehow or other, you've produced more than you're getting as a worker, and so he says all machines and all cash resources is dead labor and appropriated from someone else's work. So that drives the need for, you don't realize your profit until you can sell. And therefore, it becomes incumbent upon producers to drive demand. Now, let's shift the demand question to a different kind of social context. And if you look at advertisement, during the Second World War, women are going into the factories doing war production. There's all this stuff about how you can manage raising your family and going to work all day. And the war ends, and you have all these returning soldiers. And if you pay attention to the advertisements and the articles, it's suddenly, instead of making dinner in 15 minutes when you come home from a day of work, it's how to make a 3-hour pot roast. Or how to, and it's all this language that repositions a woman to believe that she really is doing something wrong, but not being home, right? And so it's that disconnect where people who for 5 years were making good salaries and being very productive in the workforce are suddenly told we don't need you anymore, and then we have all the arguments that we hear in the women's movement. So there is a lot of manipulation, as you well know, right? I recently saw the Mr. Rogers movie, and he has a little segment where he shows how every 5 minutes you see another kid with a gun or a desire to buy a gun, or he says the whole gun culture is driven. It's not automatic. So that's one answer to that. We manufacture desire, and we pay a lot of money for companies that know how to manufacture desire. And we get involved in, like right now I'm reading, I can have a really good phone, or for $1,000 I can have a really gooder phone, right? But is it really better? I don't know. What's going on? So this kind of stuff is certainly manufactured. Now, apropos that, an aside, when Germany was East and West, with the capitalist West Germany and the sort of communist East Germany, whatever that means, West Germany built the Volkswagen, or continued to build the Volkswagen, which was Hitler's people's car, which is literally what it stands for. And it was a cheap car, it was a common car. And what I read a recent article that said where East Germany failed is that they should have recognized that the social values should have mediated building a much better mass transit system of communication, getting around. Instead, they tried to compete and they built the Trabant, which was a failure of a car, right? And when the wall came down, and I was in Hamburg a year or two later, and you take the train to Berlin, which crosses the old east-west border, you see all these abandoned Trabants because they're cars that died, and East Germany couldn't compete with the consumer market. And at this conference, on the 200th anniversary of Marx, David Harvey gave a talk, and he was talking about the value theory of labor and all this kind of stuff. And in the middle of his talk, he stops and he has a warning, talking about how a consumer society has all these problems. And then he stops and says, now you should pay attention to this here in China. And it's all simultaneous translation. And when his talk is over, there's a very low, polite applause. And I'm sure that did not go over big, because they're trying to build a consumer society thinking it's going to. So that's the second half of your question. So we have to examine, where does this desire come from? The first part is the notion of greed. And I would say greed is also a fabrication, because there have been these sort of meta experiments. That is, let's say you have a community where you make bread for free. And so people start out walking into bakeries and taking all that they can carry. But they realize after a day or two, 2/3 of what they took is stale and is not yet edible. But they can go get more. There's no limitation. And what happens is, over time, you recognize that if there is no sense of constraint, that you will start to take what you need, and it becomes easier to provide for everybody. And that's an unlearning of this notion that there's going to be scarcity. And scarcity is one of those ideological components, I would argue, that is not unlike the notion that we've always had markets. And markets have been around from the age of human activity to the very beginning. And Marx argues that every dominant society has an ideology, and it promotes that ideology as if it's always been true. And the best way of understanding that that's maybe not true is, under feudalism, we have always had kings appointed with God's divine right of kings and the anointment of God, and there's no way to question that, and that has always been the case, that the leader has been somebody who God anointed, until a society decided to kill a bunch of aristocrats, and the world didn't come to an end. And so that ideology, which reinforced feudalism, dissipates. And now we have an ideology of scarcity, of markets being forever. And if that gets questioned, just like we see lots of literature on racism and how young children don't perceive it, but once you begin to experience the difference, you begin to develop notions of difference. And these are learned social processes. So I would say to you, if you begin with the assumption, economists like to begin with assumptions, and then they work off of that. And I remember having arguments where, the economics department or literature has this notion of ceteris paribus. All things being equal, this is what's going to happen. And so we would have conversations when I was in econ saying, okay, let's assume pigs can fly. Forget about the absurdity of that notion. Then let's discuss the aerodynamics, how fast, how high, how long, because that becomes logical given the beginning assumption. So if we assume greed is transhistorical and is always part of human nature and will never be quenched, and therefore we're subject to the fear that someone's coming to take away, right? I mean, how many articles have you read in the last 6 months showing that migrants contribute more than they take away, and yet the current mantra is they're coming to take our benefits? Now Trump is talking about removing green cards and citizenship from migrants, from immigrants that have illegally been here. And we buy into that, but it's it's catch-20. It's not it's catch-22, and it's George Orwell, newspeak. So that would be my not so short answer, which basically the bottom line is I reject the assumptions to begin with, and if you accept those assumptions, then everything else follows, and you're in a box that you can't get out of. So thank you for the question. I'm sure many people, yes, no.
So I was listening to leaders of the Beautiful Struggle yesterday on the academic site that I listened to. And Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle, they're a black movement in Baltimore that emerged after the Freddie Gray incident. And they were talking about a rejection of Marx from the black left, because they don't really feel like he's useful. He's useful to the struggle for racial justice or whatnot. And I don't know if you have read these things or have been engaged with to talk about how socialism or Marxism doesn't fit and I know those are two different things sometimes, but how socialism and Marxism doesn't fit within the black movement in the contemporary times. I was wondering, since we're talking about the relevance of Marx now, how do you feel about the relevance of Marx when it comes to racial justice struggles? Or do you think that the criticism coming from the black left is from a lack of engagement with Marx and his writings?
Okay, let me give you a little coming attraction here. What I mean by that is I'm working on what am I going to talk about at the conference in the middle of November. And one of the things that I want to explore, and I think it relates to what you're saying, is the role that identity politics plays in undermining class politics. And my question really is, I don't think, and I've had conversations with Cole about this and we don't always see eye to eye, but my question is there damage done to class politics when you focus on identity politics? And by that, I go back and I think, Malcolm X got assassinated just as he's starting to see broader alliances of racial groups dealing with economic injustice. He comes back from the Hajj and he's saying, you don't have to be black to be my ally. You don't have to be white to be my enemy. Mm-hmm. Same thing with Martin Luther. Martin Luther King gets involved in the worker strikes in Memphis, and he's moving off of the racial, freedom agenda into we cannot have racial equality without having economic equality, and then he gets assassinated. And while one could say those are circumstantial, so my feeling is when you have identity politics, you make two mistakes. And I'm going to rethink this, and I'm going to deny I said this in about 3 weeks. But I think you make two mistakes. One is the expectation that within Marxism, you have the solution to all problems. And one of the ways that when I teach undergraduate theory, I point out that there are things that are outside the realm of a Marxist analysis. And for example, if we accept that women and people of color are paid less, then on a purely economic model, we should see full employment among all people of color and women, and all unemployed workers should be white men, because they cost more. But we see that that's not true. So we have to examine other systems of relationships that have particular sort of origins. And so in terms of what goes on in Baltimore, I think it has more to do with the fact that the current discussion in the political realm, whether it's on the left or the right, doesn't pay enough attention to those factors which create the intense poverty and inequality. And I would go one step further in that we don't have any examples of a Marxist model operationally. We only have models of failed capitalist models. We have neoliberal models. We have, an emergency manager in Flint. We have, but to me it's not an accident that once you read about lead poisoning in Flint, suddenly you discover that there are cities all over the country that have even worse lead in their water. And there's a preponderance of communities of color, because communities of color are easier targets, etc. So, yes, if you turn around and say, first we deal with class conflict and then all the other problems will go away, that's a losing proposition. On the other hand, to ignore, Al Szymanski in the early 70s did an analysis of union counties in mining in Appalachia. And what he finds is that where there's no union, black and white wages are much further apart than where there is a union. But he also finds that even though white workers in non-union counties make a lot more than black miners, they make less than white miners in union counties. And so it's the question of how do we merge race politics, gender politics, without sacrificing, and there's a lot of discussion among women of color about how feminism is a white activity that doesn't really pay attention to what goes on among women of color. There's a lot of research on why is it that white women who succeed end up hiring non-white women to take over the social reproduction labor of housekeeping, childcare. So there are a lot of issues to be dealt with. And I think it's a mistake to be globalizing. I've told you before, go back and read Cedric Robinson, go back and read Oliver Cox, and there's even more recent literature on the relationship of Marxism and race and things like that. So I think it's self-preservational, issue. We have real issues today, and we're not going to find the answers in Marxism. Let's see what we can do with electoral politics. But if you read Lenin, electoral politics is, you know, one step back, two steps forward. You have to be careful what you're going for. Okay? Anyway, yes.
You started with this talk about economic prediction of crises. What's the best work from a Marxian point of view to predict crises of capital?
Well, what I would look at, the best work.
Did he work?
No. There's people like Jamie Peck is writing about zombie capitalism and the consequences of financialization.
Yeah.
And people like David Harvey is unpacking the process of capitalist crises. I would even go take a look at some of the work that, what's his name in Cleveland, does stuff on cooperative. Oh, I'm blanking on his name.
I think I know what you're talking about.
And he's looking at the various, you know, early stages of capitalism didn't run into crisis because there's lots of land and capital, and then we had lots of workers, and then finally we're with financialization, we're being squeezed. Okay, but none of those are going to tell you how to invest your retirement portfolio.
Well,
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for the opportunity.